Okay, looking backwards and looking forwards. Well, I don't know how far I'll look back. I'll look backwards over the past few decades, both for health and for being in Oxford, and I'll look forwards over the next few decades, you'll see. My main concern is premature death, and I'm not at risk of that anymore, because I've defined premature death ever since I was really only in my 30s. I've defined premature death as death before 70, and I am 70 now. And I would become the subject of ridicule were I now to change my definition. I'm 70, and, I'm still alive. But, if 40 years ago I'd have been half dead. More precisely, nowadays, only 20% die before age 70, so I'm not actually that special. But if I go back to 1970, which was my first full year in Oxford. I came here in 1969 with Richard Peto. But if I go back only to 1970, then instead of 20% of the men being dead before 70, it was 50% of the men dead before 70. That's in 1970. That's only 40 years ago. If we go back to 1870, then it would have been 80% of the men dead before 70. That's in this country, which at that time was running the British Empire. It's supposed to be a good place to be. And in fact, if you look worldwide now, 70 isn't that special. Worldwide, life expectancy is 70. That's worldwide life expectancy now. It's extraordinary. We think of everybody dying in all these poor countries at the age of 20 or 40 or whatever. Actually, the worldwide life expectancy is now 70. It's an extraordinary change that I've seen over the last 40 years. Because if you go back into the 19th century, then the changes are just absolutely extraordinary. And worldwide, only 5% of the kids die before their 5th birthday. Well, all the time I was growing up, we have all these colossal childhood death rates, and still there's a lot of millions, but it's still only 5% of all the kids. There are a lot of populations, if you go back 100 years, in fact, if you go back only 50 years, there are quite a lot of particular populations where 50% of the kids would have been dead before 5. Anyway, let's forget the world as a whole, and let's think about Oxford, looking backwards and looking forwards. And if I go back 40 years in Oxford, then, of course, it's very difficult to avoid Richard Peto, unfortunately. Yeah. And I'll sort of give a little bit of an account of how these various departments first separated and now coming together. He was Regius Professor of Medicine in 1969 to 79. 10 years he was Regius Professor of Medicine. And then after retiring from that, he then did another 22 years of epidemiology. And his department included CTSU, which was then extremely small. It's before he had his incubus, Rory Collins. And he also had the Cancer Epidemiology Unit, which has been run since the late 1980s by Valerie Burrell. Anyway, and this is a photo of him around about that time, looking extremely distinguished. I'd got to the same age as him, but I never managed to look as distinguished. He just did it effortlessly. Anyway, so 1979 came, and he retired as Regius Professor of Medicine. And at that time, CTSU, the little thing that was CTSU then, and the Cancer Epidemiology Unit, I think, at that time as well, joined David Wetherell's Nuffield Department of Clinical Medicine because I wanted CTSU to be involved with clinical medicine as well, to do the trials bit in CTSU, and also I was interested in a lot of his molecular stuff, so I elected, when Dol retired, to take the little CTSU off. And so stayed separate for the next 35 years, ending today, from other population health entities. And in the intervening years, in the intervening 35 years, which is half my lifetime, just things have just grown and grown and grown. So what have we got? I thought that was quite good, doing grew and grew and grew. I'm actually master of PowerPoint now, and some new technologies come in. Anyway, over this 35-year period, what do we do? Well, first of all, we were, in a sense, concerned with disposing of nonsense almost, rather than generating sense. We kept on saying things that were true, but nobody believed them. And the causes, we wrote a book called The Causes of Cancer, which was trying to say what was actually causing cancer. Those days, there was this, people had just discovered environmental carcinogens in really minute quantities. You know, the analytical techniques were getting much more sensitive. So all sorts of traces of this and traces of that could be found in everything. I mean, everywhere you look, there are carcinogens. In fact, it turned out that if you actually feed mice 6 grams of food a day instead of 5 grams of food a day, then they get a vastly increased risk of cancer. So obviously mouse food is a carcinogen. So that has to be banned. But if you tried to quantify, if you tried to say what proportion of all cancers, I mean, there were claims that something like a third of all US cancer deaths were just due to 6 particular occupational carcinogens. It was just completely mad. I mean, the claims were just absolutely off the wall. It just wasn't real. And in the process, of course, attention was being diverted from tobacco. And so there was a wonderful 1981 quote from some guy in the tobacco industry saying that, you know, the cancer scare wasn't hitting sales as hard because so many things have been linked to cancer now that people are beginning to take a more objective view of the health evidence. And so anyway, we tried to be quantitative. And of course, you know, smoking was causing more cancer deaths than every other cause put together in countries like the UK and the US, and it was killing more people from other diseases than it was killing from cancer. So we were then said to be tools of industry. I don't know why. Anyway, the other main thing is large-scale randomised data, which you've heard a lot about today, mega trials and meta-analysis. It was obvious that we needed randomised evidence on a scale at least 10 or 100 times larger than it was generally being done. I mean, trials were just ridiculously small. It was just obvious. And we advertised that trials ought to be bigger. People just thought we were mad. But then just doing a few trials that actually produced striking answers, where a big trial produces a striking answer, doctors suddenly thought, this is interesting. That didn't really happen until the late 80s, though. It was really not till 1988 that people really became convinced that this actually made medical sense. It wasn't just statistical nonsense. And then all these collaborative meta-analyses that people can't pronounce, Epicago. And then we started getting interested in China more and more. And of course, China's where the big numbers are. You know, if you want to actually deal, only 1% of the world is British. 99% of the world is not British. And so, obviously, it's much better to do stuff internationally. So we did. We started branching out into the various countries of the world, at least those of them that would have us. And we were very lucky in the Chinese collaborators that we met in the 1980s, 1990s, and that's led to all sorts of things in CTSU. This is a history of CTSU, I'm afraid. It's a bit CTSU biased. Blood pressure, cholesterol you've heard about, regression dilution. It's funny, Jerry Stamler was always so keen on, you know, how important cholesterol was, how important blood pressure was. And when we sorted out the regression dilution, just the fact that there was inaccuracy of measurement meant you were underestimating the effects, he just wouldn't accept it. But he was actually saying that what he was saying was even more important than he was saying it was. So he kept on saying it was really important. Other people said it wasn't. And he just wouldn't accept it. It's odd. Anyway, it's generally accepted now. And we've had a lot of collaborations with the Cancer Epidemiology Unit, which is now upstairs in the Richard Dole building. But again, it's all been getting bigger. 1 million women studied. God, when we started off, 1.3 million women, when we started off studying oral contraceptives when I first came to Oxford, we got 17,000 of them. And then Valerie goes and does 1.3 million. Statin trials, tamoxifen trials, global evidence on tobacco. This business, we've done studies in lots of countries, so that's only 4 of them. So that was all that would fit on the screen. But overall, the idea that tobacco was a serious global health problem, if you talked about, child mortality, child survival, safe motherhood in, the National Cancer Institute in the States, they'd think, this is ridiculous, this is irrelevant, we're dealing with cancer, we're talking about what kills the rich, that's what matters. And conversely, if you went and talked to anybody who was really interested in global health then being defined as child survival and safe motherhood, about saying, well, there are some things that are, actually worth doing on the same, even if you use the same metric to define human value, there are things that are worth doing about death in middle age, and they thought you didn't know anything about global health. And now there's there's been a movement towards really seeing premature death, just as, that's what matters, and the more prematurely you die, the worse. Death at 20, other things being equal, is worse than death at 40, which is worse than death at 80. And so tobacco has been accepted as a global health problem only since the 1990s, and I think that CTSU studies and, Richard's influence, his sort of urbane, well-behaved manner, and also some of mine as well, has helped get that to go. Prospective studies with gallons of blood, and so on. Everything's getting bigger and bigger, including the staff, the administrative staff, the lab staff, and the buildings. I mean, the idea, we used to live in huts. It's extraordinary. I know. Anyway, so that's the past. So there's the past 35 years. That's what I can remember of it anyway. And what's the next 35 years going to bring? Well, we're predicting that if people keep smoking the way they will, we're going to have 100 million tobacco deaths per decade by mid-century, that we're going to have 1 billion tobacco deaths this century. And, sure, tobacco deaths have gone down very nicely in this country, but they're going up in China and a lot of other places too, particularly China. So what's going to happen? Are we really going to be at 100 million tobacco deaths per decade? Is there going to be widespread gross adiposity? According to the front page of the Daily Mail today, obesity is even worse than smoking was back in the 1960s, which is complete nonsense. I mean, it's unbelievable how wrong the Mail is every time. It's surprising. It's just, it's just amazing there are any Mail readers left alive. Are we going to have 100 million cases of serious dementia with Alzheimer's, or are we actually going to discover actually what the mechanism is and find out ways of doing something about it? Well, yeah, probably. Probably we will. Maybe it's not going to be that bad. Vascular dementia overall is going down. And also this worldwide epidemic of non-communicable disease. I mean, does everybody know that the death rates from non-communicable disease are really going down steadily worldwide? About 1.4% per year, 14% per decade. They're going down, not up. There's more people getting to old age. Obviously, everybody gets old, is going to die when they're old. But actually, the age-specific, age-standardised death rates are going down, not up. This epidemic of... of course there's an epidemic, because we've actually got, what we're doing, we're getting rid of the other deaths, and what's left? It's a funny sort of epidemic. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I am saying that we ought to be looking at the trends in age-standardised mortality. We could easily have another 1918, 1919 flu epidemic. I don't know whether flu or some other thing. Are we going to have 100 million dying in an epidemic? Are we going to have environmental collapse? Are we going to have nuclear war? Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously, you don't know. We could. Here we are. We're coming up to 2014. Who in that's the anniversary of the way the 20th century, when the 20th century went wrong. Who in 1913 would have had any idea what was coming? And, yes, things could easily get vastly worse, but they also might not. And that's, you don't... I used to have a badge saying well-meaning Guardian readers against the bomb. That's not... It's not really much of a slogan. But anyway, prevention and treatment are still winning, with a few horrible exceptions. I mean, war in the Congo, HIV in southern Africa over the last 20 years, alcohol when the Soviet Union collapsed. Although in Russia, even in Russia, over the last 7 years, deaths from drink in Russian men before the age of 55 are down 1/3. Overall we're winning. In most places we're winning. So overall we're winning. And I think, there's a fair chance, if we're lucky, that when we look back on the period from 1850 to 2050, well, when you look back on the period from 1850 to 2050, then we'll think this is the 200-year period in which humanity actually largely got rid of premature death as being normal. And I think that's very reasonable hope. All these horrible things are possible, but I think that overall, since all, if we can avoid catastrophic war, social collapse, and so on and so forth, and if we don't have a pandemic, and certainly there's environmental disasters, and apart from anything else, we're just destroying habitat and losing species, which is ridiculous, quite apart from human life. But overall, things have got incredibly much better. People in 1913 wouldn't have been able to glimpse how good health would have been now, and how rapidly it's increasing worldwide. So I think it may happen, it may well be that people will look back on the period 1850 to 2050, that 200-year period, as the period in which death or disability before age 70 became uncommon throughout the world. I hope so, and I do think that just the work on prevention and treatment that has been done here and will continue to be here will help. I shouldn't be there to see it because I don't think avoiding death before 100 is a good thing, but it doesn't matter whether it's a good thing or a bad thing because it isn't happening. The deaths before 70 are disappearing, but still pretty well everybody dies before. And if you don't die before 100, well, it doesn't matter much because you're not going to be very much longer after that anyway. I mean, the death rate when you're 100 is 50% per year. So only 1 in 1,000 of those who reach 100 reaches 110. This idea of life going on and on and on until our life expectancy is 160, I think, is absolute nonsense. It's not the way it's working. But I do think we can get to the point where premature death is largely a thing of the past. And I hope that's what happens. Thank you.